friends. Welcome to the Living Truth podcast. This is Kristen Carey hosting today, and I am very excited to talk to Shawna Meek. Shawna, thank you so much for being on the Living Truth podcast with me today.
You're welcome. It's so good to be here and see you again.
Yes. You guys, I've known Shawna for several years. She is an APSATS trained coach. If you're not real familiar with this whole world yet, APSATS stands for the Association of Partner of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. So, meaning she has specialized training to help betrayed partners recover from the impact of sexual betrayal. Shawna has her own coaching practice called Living Stones, and she is a very recent author of her book, Determined for More. Sean, is there anything else you want our audience to know about you?
I'm sure it'll come out as we chat,
Uh-huh.
but you caught the big stuff. So just honored to be here and do this work and to put a book out into the world and
Yeah.
take these steps. So yeah, I'm sure
Your
it'll come out as
story
we chat.
and your work are both very, very important. And so, thank you for taking the risk to put yourself out there in the world. Friends, before I start asking Shawna some questions about her story and her work, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, would you take a moment to pause this episode and wherever you listen to podcasts, write a review or rate the Living Truth podcast? What that does is it helps more people find us. It tweaks the algorithm so that more people who need the help that we have for people with unwanted sexual behavior or betrayal would find the Living Truth podcast. So if you would take a moment to do that, we would so appreciate it. So Shawna, how long have you been on this journey of betrayal trauma recovery for yourself? How long have you known this was a thing in your life?
So it has been just a month ago, 15 years officially.
Yeah.
So I would say that was our discovery and disclosure kind of when that started was 15 years ago. There was other parts of our story, but I would say that was the big, like, bomb dropping moments for
Yeah.
sure.
Wow. So many of us as partners have a crisis of faith along the way. It's a huge thing, sounds like in your story too. What would you say was your biggest wrestle with God?
Oh, yeah, there were lots of moments, lots of moments of wrestle. Our story is unique, and I won't get into all of the details, but it's in the book too. But the thing that is unique about our story is we were married and then we were divorced at 3 years. We were remarried 3 years later. And then the betrayal was in the second marriage. So
The
by the time
second marriage, but to the same person.
the same person.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think, okay, we've got this fresh beginning, right? And then the betrayal comes about, I think it was about 6 years into our second marriage. And so that was probably my first biggest wrestle because I came to know the Lord when we were divorced.
Oh,
So that was like, I mean, I knew of God, but I didn't know God. And so it was just such a personal relationship that had started in that time. So
mhm.
I thought, well, this has got to be a good fresh start. And so 6 years in, finding out about the betrayal and his unfaithfulness and all of that, that was probably my biggest, or I'll say my first moment. And then many moments thereafter. One of the biggest things that was a wrestle through the years, even after the discovery, after the disclosure, after he had began to repair from the sexual betrayal,
Mhm.
was the emotional deprivation, because that was from the beginning all the way through. And so that emotional deprivation of why did you instill this longing in my heart to be pursued and to be cared for, to have someone emotionally deprive me of that in marriage? That never made sense to me. So I would say that was probably aside from the big moments of what are you doing, God? Why are you allowing this? That long-standing emotional deprivation was probably my biggest wrestle through
And
the
when
years.
you talk about emotional deprivation, I'd love for you to maybe bullet point how that manifested in your marriage.
Yeah.
And I have a subsequent question, and that is, did it start that way? Or at what point did the emotional deprivation set in?
That's a great question. So I'll start with the second one, and then I'll go to the bullet points. I would say I noticed it at the beginning. I noticed the emotional deprivation. I noticed the lack of ability for him to connect early on. There was a lot of facade or him trying to put things in place to connect or to be emotionally available. And in some ways he was, but in the deepest longings and vulnerabilities of my heart, I would say for us, that was from the beginning. So it really was. It was dating before even engagement.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes I hear different stories, of, oh, we got married and it flipped. For us, it was kind of always there. And some of the things that I noticed, if I were to kind of bullet point them out, were his lack of response to my deeper feelings. So I might share something and his lack of response, he would just kind of stare at me or, you know, um, just not say anything. And I'm like, What's going on here? Why aren't we connecting in this?" Um, the emotional deprivation, if I shared a concern or a grievance of something that seemed reasonably smaller for me, um, such as, when you said that, gosh, that made me feel left out in that conversation. And it would explode really big and then it would minimize my emotional experience. So if I had a grievance or just a concern that I would share, because I spoke up pretty early in our relationship. And so those were some things. I would say the lack of follow through was an emotional deprivation kind of characteristic for us. He would say he would do something, and then I would say, "Why did it fall off?" Like, it just never happened again. But I thought you knew how to do it. And that could even be in therapy through the years of he learned how to do it. We'd been in the counselor's office and he learned how to do it, and then it would just disappear.
Mm,
Those are probably like three things I could think of just off the top of my head.
yeah. And so here you are feeling this emotional deprivation, feeling this loss of connection. And along the way, as we talked about before we hit record, you had some pretty profound revelations about other co occurring conditions. This was not just sex addiction here. So, do you want to share your kind of bullet points of your journey of we thought it was this and then we thought it was that? And because as our listeners may have discovered, if they've been on the journey a while, there are very often other conditions besides just a sexual addiction, or sometimes it's not a sex addiction, it's something else, but there's problematic sexual behavior involved. But if you just treat one thing and not the others, it's like trying to put a 500-piece puzzle together when you're missing like 100 of the pieces. It's just not going to come together. So tell us all the things you thought it could be, and then what you actually have discovered on your journey that was a big factor in your relational dynamics and in your husband's struggles.
Yeah. And here's the interesting thing. Here's what I'll caveat too, because sex addiction was even hard for us to define. In our story, because he didn't have porn use as a problem, it was infidelity, chronic infidelity that he tried to stop. So it was addictive in nature. We knew that. But even the definition 15 years ago for sex addiction, it didn't like fit perfectly. So we were always kind of looking for what is this and why is this? And so it is sex addiction. It was actually, clinically diagnosed, but a version of love addiction, which is also
Mm,
kind of a subset because he was craving that love, but yet he didn't really know what love was. And so it was the uniqueness of crossing boundary lines and he would act like, gosh, I didn't really know it would go that far. And I'm like, what? How in the world? Right. So even that was hard for us to define. And then once that was defined, and he did a lot of recovery work, he really stepped into trust. We didn't get harmed at the level that some did 15 years ago. So we're very grateful for
yeah.
that.
You mean that you
He
found good therapeutic support early on that didn't traumatize you? Good.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. And we found minimal support because we just kind of were like DIYing it, do it
Yeah.
yourself. in a
Yes.
lot of ways, but our church
Yes.
didn't hurt us, professionals didn't hurt, so we didn't have that. So I'm just very sensitive to those that have had that, because you're kind of going back on what was said in an authoritarian kind of manner of
Yeah.
sorts.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of searching ourselves. So in addition to the sex addiction slash love addiction, what we did notice, even after that trust had been built, safety had been established, I knew truth. Um, the thing that just kept coming back was why there were a lot of meltdowns, there were a lot of shutdowns for him. And again, that
Can
emotional
you
deprivation
can I pause you? When you say
yeah.
meltdown, what does that mean?
Okay, meltdown for us was like an emotional, it looked very young. It felt very young. It would be something that would be a very exaggerated response from him. So we might be in an argument over something, and then it would be, I can't do this. I need to leave the house. And it was very exaggerated and volatile at times, not physically volatile, but emotionally volatile in a sense
And when
of,
you say volatile, you mean anger
I do.
or
Yep.
like dysregulation of like complete crying? Because when I hear meltdown, I
Uh-huh.
think of like crying out of control. But that's why I wanted to ask you what
Good.
it meant.
And I think it can mean both. So I'm glad you asked. Because for us, Kevin, so my husband's name is Kevin, he went to anger. So unless it was, I'll explain kind of a difference between a meltdown and a shutdown for us. And every couple is different. The meltdowns were more of, he couldn't contain his own emotion or what was coming at him, and stay in a regulated state. So stay calm enough to have a conversation, basically. And he would get louder. He would get, he'd have more of a grimace on his face. Um, he might walk away out of anger. Uh, he might say things that, and I respond more in fight first as well. So I knew, okay, we would just kind of do this ladder thing where, okay, now we're both going, but it might have been a reasonable thing where he could have just settled and said, oh, I did do that, or I didn't come back, or I didn't come home when I said I would, or those sorts of things. But instead he would get in this defense mode as if I was his enemy. So
Hmm.
that would be, and he would push out. This is how I like to explain it. He would push out towards me as if I was the problem. So a lot of blaming, but you did it this way, you said it this way, all the way down to very minute things. But usually it would be, the form of, he felt attacked, he felt, and it might not have been the case. Sometimes it might have been mildly how I said it, or different times how I said it for sure. But other times it would be like, whoa, it was very exaggerated.
Yeah.
And then the shutdown would sometimes come after that. So the shutdown, I'm not going to talk. I'm
Yeah.
leaving the house. Um, I'm shutting the door. And so that would hit for me on like the abandonment kind of piece of, I thought we were having a conversation. I thought we could do this. But usually we get the meltdown and then the shutdown would
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I think a lot of people are going to listen to this and really relate to some of these patterns. So this was all in the context of talking about your journey to trying to understand all the pieces of the puzzle.
Yes. Okay.
If you want to pick that back up.
I will. I will. So early on, I just wasn't sure. I thought it was more of, he did have some childhood neglect and didn't really know how to um, solve relational conflict. I had some dysfunction in learning how to solve relational conflict. So we both kind of came in to the marriage going, what is healthy conflict and how do we keep it at a lower level? Um, and and I'll speak to my anger for a second, and then I'm going to come back to that because I think this is important. My response in a fight response was often the first defense for me. So that kind of part of me that would try and be reasonable, regulated. And then as soon as I'd feel like, wait, how am I the enemy in this and feel separated from him, then my response would heighten. And that was my first response. So then sometimes I would get louder. If I got louder, then that did not help him at all. Um, and so I say that because we really had to learn how to speak, and this took a lot of time, how to speak in I statements and I need this when, this is what would help me if, those sorts of things. And even when I did speak like that, his response sometimes it still wouldn't be like it was with other people. And I thought,
Yeah.
this is odd. So through the years, I would say, are you, narcissistic personality disorder? Do you have NPD? Do
I'm
you
sure
have
he loved it when you asked
right?
that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. All of them. I had lists through the years, and he'd just be like, "It's not that." I'm like, "Then what is it? Help me understand this."
Yeah.
Is it bipolar? Because you're acting so kind, and then you're not. You're like flipping your lid. Um, then for a long time, about 6 years, we found, intimacy anorexia and thought, "Oh, it's that. It's got to be that because he's intentionally withholding from me." And then we did groups and we did things like that, and I thought, "It's not always intentional. So now what is it?" Right? And so we had lists, and I will say probably back in 2021, 2022, before we got another diagnosis, we had lists and he was willing because we had been through so much therapy. And it's like he would be in the therapist's office, he would understand emotionally focused therapy, he would understand some of the Gottman work, and then we'd leave and it was like, where'd the scaffolding go? It would just like fall. We can't build the house, right? And so, so there was a list, and he would even look at it, and he would be researching it. So he, by that point in our journey, was open to say what else is going on. And
That
at
takes a
one,
lot of humility on his part,
yes,
which
yeah,
is a key
oh,
to recovery. Humility is like a cornerstone.
1,000%.
Mhm.
I see that in the willingness, right?
Yes.
We
Yes.
we looked at that, and we could talk about that more, but the willingness versus his capacity or his ability.
Mm. Mm. Tell me more about that. I mean,
Yeah,
but then I'm taking you in another
I
direction. We're
know.
still talking about
That's
your
okay.
story.
No, no, no.
I have
We'll come back
so
to
many
it. We'll come
questions
back to
for
it.
you.
We'll come back to it.
Okay.
Willing, so I think this is a really key part because the humility in it, there's a lot of times he would just defend, "Nope, it's not that." Well,
Mhm.
then can we sit down and look at other things, right? But once he got to the point where there was one moment in particular, and I remember us being in a heated conversation, and I said, "I don't understand why you're not responding, but you seem to want to. You seem to want to respond a certain way. I feel your heart wants to, but something's blocking that." And he yelled pretty loud, "Why can't I be normal?" I know, I know. And that moment for him, I think he was like, "I've got to figure out what this is." And there had been many years where he was open to hearing, the intimacy anorexia. That took some time. That
Mhm.
a lot of humility to say, "Oh, that's it." Childhood trauma. Okay, I'm going to go after that. I'm going to do a lot of that work because he had done a lot of that work. And so when he said that, I mean, my heart just broke because I thought, A, what is normal? But I know what he was saying in that moment. Why can't I respond the way I want to with you? Because he did have a willingness there, but the ability was lacking. And I know working with so many partners, and that willingness needs to be there, or we can't even see if the ability is there.
Oh my gosh, say that again.
That willingness needs to be there, or we can't even know if that ability is there.
Yes. Okay. I love that's very important.
I think, and that goes along with the humility, right? To have willingness, we need humility.
Mhm.
We need to diminish shame that's going
Yeah.
to matter to say, Nope, you're not normal. I mean, he was crying out, why am I not normal? He wasn't saying it, it wasn't a shameful way he was saying that. He was crying out like to the Lord with me.
Mhm.
And that part of, again, I think there was something he knew was missing. And so that part, I could work with that. I
Mhm.
could work with someone that was willing. There were parts he wasn't willing. There was part he was very defensive. We'd have
Right.
very defensive situations. But in those moments, I'm like, I will do this with us. I will do this with you.
Yeah.
And so that allowed me, my heart to soften, to say he's willing and he's desiring. And there was nothing at that point in our journey. He had been in recovery in 12 step for, gosh, that had probably been 12 years by that point. And so, and in much before that, he was willing to see what things were. And so it was a matter of, okay, now what is it? So that's when we started. I'll go back to the list and we'd make lists. Is it this? And I go do some research and he'd go do some research. We're like, you don't fall under all those characteristics. OCD. He's like, he kept always saying, I have OCD. I'm like, yeah, you are very particular. You do like things in a certain order. Those all, in theory, that's not all OCD is. But in my naive mind was, okay, sure. But is that causing all this relational conflict? All these communication things where our brains are going in different directions. We're like two planes passing. Um, does that equate to, miscues of my facial expressions? All of that. I mean, even I remember our youngest daughter at the time was probably about 9, and we sat in the church parking lot. We were a little early for church, and he gave an expression that looked angry. And he goes, I'm not angry. And both of us go, you look angry. And he's like, I'm not angry. So even how he expressed himself and how he received was very different from us. And so we took out like facial expression charts in the parking lot at church and went, does it look like you did this? And he's like, no. And we're like, that's what we saw. So even those things. So then we knew there were more things and we started bringing in like, could it be something else? And then I took it to my therapist and I would share these exchanges that we would have and these experiences. And this was the summer of 2022, I believe. And she put it on the table as a possibility that he was on the spectrum for autism, that he
Mhm.
was showing some what were Asperger traits. That's not technically a diagnosis these days, but the
Mhm.
traits. And I thought, huh,
Social communication struggles. Social
yep,
communication struggles, and then the hyperfixation,
yep, yep.
the what you thought could be OCD, hyperfixation it's an autism trait too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And even his thoughts in that moment, he would get fixated on a certain thought. And it was, now I call it dog with a bone. And I'm like, can you let go of the bone? Like the bone's not that important right now. Can you, like his thoughts would just be so narrow. Um, and it was that way or no way. And then the intimacy, and he'd say, I'm kind of okay. I don't really need a lot of connection. Like I I'm kind of okay, but I'm doing it for us because you matter to me. And, so all of that. So you could put all these characteristics. Then we started queuing into other things. So summer of 2022, back to that, we did some self-assessments online, just found some. I took it first and was like, oh gosh, here we go. I'm going to tell him one more thing. Like, is he going to get defensive? Is he open to this? So we were sitting at lunch one day, went out to lunch, and I said, hey, we're in public, right? It's a little safer there.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you willing to take this little assessment? And he was kind of like, huh, sure. So he takes it. His scores show no.
It's an
My
autism assessment.
it was an autism self-assessment
Okay.
online.
Uh-huh.
Scores show no, that it wasn't. My scores of him show yes, it was. So I was like, okay, what do we do with that? So we just kind of left it for months, months and months and months. Then he had what we now know was a big meltdown that was the catalyst to, why did I do that? Why did I go to that extreme in an argument? He called a 30-day separation from an argument. we don't do that in our marriage. We're like,
Yeah.
that is not, no, we don't call 30 days without counsel and conversation. We don't leave the house for 30 days. Like, no, we don't do that.
Right.
That point, I didn't know, is he being faithful? What is it? Turns out he was faithful. He earned himself a disclosure and an inventory and a polygraph to
Yeah.
confirm that. But he also at that point was like, there's got to be something else. So then we picked up the possibility of him being on the spectrum, um, back on the table. And I heard a podcast myself. So hence to the podcast. And thank you for what you do, because this opens eyes to
Yes.
experiences. I heard a podcast that went, oh my gosh, it is ASD.
What
It's
was it
autism
in the
spectrum.
podcast that made the connection? What did you hear that made you think this is autism?
It was the way this particular person was talking. She's autistic, and she was talking about the characteristics and how they all lined up, and
Mhm.
other things in there of sensory sensitivities. We
Yep.
never considered that. We never considered why he'd get so upset when I lit a candle. And I'm like, why are you controlling me? We
Mm.
never considered the bright light that he would get dysregulated by because he sat in a certain place on the couch when we were having a conversation.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. The smells, the comments he would make that I felt like, why are you criticizing how I'm cooking? Just, it was his scent sensitivity,
Yeah.
sight, sound, scent, like a lot of things, even touch.
Yeah.
Oh, that gets brought into it. Then, and she's bringing up things in her own world. And it wasn't this particular podcast that was like the magic of it all. It was just, I got to hear things about the characteristics and going, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
if you line all of that up, huh? And it was just like checking boxes and checking boxes. And then the biggest part was she was talking about masking and camouflaging.
That's what I was wondering, if that was what was happening when he would do things like in the therapist's office. He would be able to like it's like a mimicking. You can mimic it, but it's yes. Go ahead. Continue about the
Yeah,
masking.
no, I want to hear it because you know a lot about this world
Well,
too.
yeah, it's so just for our listeners, because I don't know if I've ever talked about this on our podcast, is that my son, who's currently 19, has autism and didn't get diagnosed till he was 12. And it was very frustrating up until that 12-year-old point because we kept taking it to specialists like something, we're missing something here. And when we finally got the diagnosis, and I am still learning about which of his behaviors and reactions are related to autism, that some of them that I'll think this is willful. And then
Yeah,
later I realize, oh, this is part of his autism. And so masking and camouflaging is a big one for us too. So Shauna, tell me more about how you experience that.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and what
Uh-huh.
there's so much relatability. Um, so this is how Kevin would describe it that I think is really helpful. Is he said, I tried to fit into a world that I thought needed me to be a certain way.
Mm,
And from a young age, he was watching, he was observing, he was memorizing how the world responded to certain things.
right.
Uh, he was making equations, truly. I mean, we talk about it now, formulas, equations. Now we talk about it in more like rhythms. Can we have a rhythm instead of a formula? But he would mimic, he would mirror. He would do that with me. I would say something, then he would say something. Um, he would watch and observe, like, when do I say something in this conversation? But he would be lagging because of the way his neurology was firing and wiring. Um, and the masking was like a cover because I can't be that different. I can't be that different. So I'm going to try and mask and put this on, which a lot of times I look back and I'm like, chicken or the egg, what came first? You were trying to fit in. Now you're trying to feel loved in a world that you weren't
Mm.
the mask wasn't removed. You were trying to fit in all these places. And I always called it people pleasing, which, okay, we can all have some level of people pleasing, but it's a different
This is
level.
different. And I
Yep.
wanted to point that out, Shawna, because um, to to a lot of betrayed partners, I would assume this idea or concept of he had a mask on or he was masking could sound like, oh yeah, my husband does that too, because he was acting like he was this good Christian man, but really he was acting out. And so he had
Yes,
a mask on. What we're describing as masking in this particular situation is different. It's autism related, right? And it is an attempt to make up for deficits
absolutely.
rather
Yes,
than an attempt to deceive.
100%. I couldn't agree more. The motive is different than to
Yeah,
deceive. And he did have, I will say, he did mask, he did pretend, he did
sure.
placate me,
That may
right?
have happened also. But
Mhm.
this is what
But
we're
this
describing
is
about the masking here is different from that.
very much.
Yep.
Yep. Because it was his deficits. It wasn't acting out, it wasn't sinful behaviors, it wasn't deceptive behaviors necessarily. It was, gosh, it was I don't know what to do, so I've got to mimic that.
It's
I've got
social communication
so
masking. That's what it is. It's so as you and I talk right now, like neither of us is really exerting or making an effort to connect. I mean,
yep,
at least I feel the flow of just back and forth social, facial expressions, and I hear you and I'm resonating with you. You hear me, you're resonating with me. And it happens, it just flows.
yep,
And with autism, that does not happen. It has to be like a logical think through, now what do I say, versus an intuitive responsiveness.
yep. You said it so great. Yeah, it's exactly right. And that's what he longed for. He wanted that intuitive response. I wanted that intuitive response.
Right.
Talk about empathy. I wanted that intuitive, emotional empathy. He could give cognitive and intellectual empathy, but he couldn't mirror what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
Couldn't give me that level of mirroring,
Yeah.
that happened very often. And even still, I'll say, "Do you have something to say?" And he's like, "Ooh, I'm really feeling it." Well, you can't sometimes tell, but he's willing to say, "Oh, this is what's going on inside." You can't see that, right? So it's when he removes that mask, like you and I just naturally happening like this, we see the differences more between us. But I want to see him even in the differences. I don't want him trying to camouflage to say the right thing for me and there's learning that comes with this. So lots of learning. I mean, but it's not natural. It's not as intuitive
Yeah.
for him.
So, hello, emotional maturity in you, Shauna. I mean, like the fact that that you have this level of perseverance, that you're like, I am not just going to give up on this. It's incredible. Your willingness, I just have to say that, your willingness to persevere and to be open to the idea that maybe you were missing something that could actually contribute to an intimate marriage. And when I say intimate marriage, listeners, I'm not talking about sex.
Yeah.
Intimate meaning intimacy, like I know you, you know me, I care about you, you care about me, and your ability to um, pivot your direction and be open to other possibilities of knowing him, really knowing him, is incredibly beautiful and powerful. I'm sure you've worked really hard and done a lot of surrendering and a lot of on your knees to get here. This is not easily won.
And on my face on the carpet. God, why? Those moments
Yeah.
too. But thank you. There's something God built in me to do that. And I don't take all the credit, but there's something there, to take those next steps to say, there were so many times that I just stood at metaphorically the threshold of our marriage door. Um, was just like, is this worth it? Is this worth it to stay? And I know a lot of listeners are probably saying that same thing. And I needed that willingness from him. I really did. I needed to be able to see the deficits. I needed him to be able to see those. Um,
Rather than deflect and blame you.
exactly. And be like, well, it's the way you said that. And I'm like, hmm,
So do we
hmm.
do that less now?
What's that? I know.
Does he do that a lot less now that he has the insight and the awareness? Okay, that's so
For
good.
sure. For sure. Oh, yeah. Because a lot of the work with his therapist he's doing kitty cue cards on facial expressions. They're like younger cue cards. He's doing what's going on somatically for him. He's recognizing when those sensations are lower rather than when they're up here, and then I finally hear them or see them, or those feelings or whatever it might be. So his regulation, it can improve. It's not just a death sentence, but
No.
it take a lot of grief. It's been a lot of grieving of the reality. It was like when he officially got the diagnosis in late 22, it was like we were holding grief and we were holding like hope in the other hand, because those, and they were simultaneous,
Mhm.
and we'd flip flop. And I told him, actually, he told me, and I agreed at that time, now that we have this, like, I want you to have choice in the relationship. I wish I would have known. And I didn't know all of this. And so he gave me choice again in the
You need
relationship.
to leave?
Yes. Yes. And at that point, my heart was broken for him. He's like, if you need that, like, I don't know what this looks like now. That was part of his grieving process. If you need to leave now, I said, this isn't something I'm leaving for. As long as you're willing to do the work, as long as you're willing to learn, as long as you're willing to see and hear and meet some of my needs, like, it isn't just about your deficits. I still have needs and desires in the relationship. So that's the marriage I was willing to stay for.
Oh,
But I really, looked at that. God was already prepping my heart around a marriage I was willing to stay for, even though it was, quote, sexually faithful. The infidelity was past, but I was still really wrestling with, is this a marriage I can stay for? And so the Lord had prepped my heart months before the diagnosis. So
mm.
his kindness.
Shawna, thank you so much. We're gonna pick this conversation back up in another episode, friends. We are gonna release the second part of my conversation with Shawna in 2 weeks. So please tune into that. You're not gonna want to miss hearing the rest of Shawna's story. Thank you so much for joining us on the Living Truth podcast. And until the next episode, I am holding out hope for you.